Hello students, today we are going to start with the skeletal system. The skeletal system consists of the different parts which include bones, joints, cartilages and ligaments. The skeletal system is mainly divided into two divisions. First is axial skeleton and second is appendicular skeleton. Now coming on to the functions of bones or the skeletal system. First of all is the support. That is, the skeletal system is responsible for holding up the soft tissues and maintaining the body shape. Second is the protection of the internal organ which are critical for the survival such as brain, heart and lungs. Next, the skeletal system also acts as a lever system wherein the muscle acts on the bones to produce the movement. The skeletal system also acts as a reservoir for the mineral storage, for example, calcium, phosphates, etc. So, the matrix of the bones is composed of the minerals. The skeletal system is a place for bones, blood cell formation. The blood is formed in the bone marrow. Functions of cartilages. Cartilage is a model for the bone growth and it is abundant in the embryo and the fetus. It acts as a model from which most adult bones develop. Cartilage also provides a smooth cushion between the adjacent bones. It provides firm, flexible support to the ear, nose, ribs, and trachea. Also, it acts as a cushion which is reducing the friction between the two bones. Cartilage is relatively rigid, but again gains its original shape if bent or slightly compressed. Also, it acts as an excellent shock absorber. Next is the ligaments and tendons, which are important portions of the skeletal system. Ligaments are attached to the bones and they attach one bone to the another. Ligaments are also responsible for providing stability. Next is the tendons. Tendons attach the muscles to the bones. Tendon also acts as an anchor muscle to the bone for movement. Example is Achilles tendons. Next, coming on to the bones, information regarding the bones of human body. The adult skeleton consists of 206 bones which makes up 18 to 20% of our body weight. There are basically two types of bony tissue as per the structure is concerned. First one is the compact or dense bone, which is also known as solid bone. The name itself indicates that the structure is compact, the structure is homogeneous. In the diagram you can find it. The structure of spongy bone is the compact one and the structure of compact bone is very compact and the spongy bone is having trabeculae or it is porous in nature. Compact bone is also known as solid bone because its structure is dense, homogeneous and it forms the diaphysis of the long bones. Diaphysis means the body or the shaft of the bones and thinner surface of all the other bones. Next is cancellous bone or spongy bone. Spongy bone is also known as porous bone because if you see the structure in the diagram, the structure consists of the spongy structure and it is porous and it consists of the spaces in between. They consist of small needle-like pieces of bone. Many open spaces are present in between the bones and they form the epiphysis of the long bones and center of the other bones. Epiphysis means the ends of the long bones. Next, moving on to the classification of bone on the basis of shape. If we classify the bones according to the shape, then the bones are classified as long bones, flat bones, short bones and irregular bones. First one is the long bones, example humerus of the bone. As the name itself indicates, they are long and they have got head and the condyloid process, while the others are, second is flat bones. Flat, the name itself indicates their structure is flat. Example bones of the skull, parietal bone of the skull. Next is short bones. Short bones, their structure is very short or small. For example, carpals of the wrist and tarsals of the ankle. Then we have another type of bone according to the shape. Having irregular shape, they are also known as irregular bones. For example, vertebrae of the vertebral column. So, dependent on the shape and size of the bones, they are classified into long bones, flat bones, short bones, and irregular bones. Long bones typically are longer than wide. In the diagram you can see the structure. It has got a shaft or the body which is also known as diaphysis and having the two ends which is called as epiphysis. It contains mostly compact bone. Examples are femur, humerus. If still growing, has an epiphyseal growth or plate composed of cartilage between epiphysis and diaphysis. So cartilage is present over the structure of the epiphysis, which acts as a cushion for the long bones. The next is a short bone. Short bones are generally cube shaped and they are mostly made up of spongy bones. Examples are carpals and tarsals, carpals of the wrist and tarsals of the ankle. Flat bones are thin and flattened, as the name itself indicates. They are usually curved, thin layers of the compact bone around a layer of spongy bone, for example, skull, ribs, sternum, and scapula. So, in the picture, you can see the structure of flat bones. Next is irregular bones. Their name itself indicates that their shape is irregular. They do not fit into the bone classification categories because of their different shapes. Example is vertebral and facial bones. Now moving on to the gross anatomy of the bone. The long bone consists of diaphysis, that is the shaft or body of the bone, which is mostly composed of the compact bone. Second is epiphysis. Epiphysis means the ends of the bones, which are usually composed of the spongy bone or porous bone. So in the diagram you can see that diaphysis means the body or shaft of the long bones, while the two ends, that is proximal epiphysis and distal epiphysis, are the two ends of the bone. The diaphysis consists of the compact bone while the epiphysis consists of the spongy bone. Now moving on to the anatomical structure of the long bones. The outer structure of the long bones consists of the periosteum. Periosteum is the outermost covering of the diaphysis, that is shaft or body of the bone. It consists of fibrous connective tissue membrane. Next is Sharpie's fiber. They secure the periosteum to underlying the bone. So in the diagram you can see the fibers, the Sharpie's fibers or perforating fibers. Next is arteries. The bone have rich supply of arteries. So these arteries supply the bones with the nutrients. So in the diagrams you can see the arteries which are supplying the nutrients. Next is articular cartilage. Articulation means connecting one bone to the another. So articular cartilage is the one which is present at the ends of the bone in between the two joints. In between the joints wherein two bones are forming a joint. Cartilage covers the external surface of the epiphysis, that is ends of the bones. It is usually made of the hyaline cartilage and it decreases the friction between the surface of the joints. It also consists of the medullary cavity, which is the cavity of the shaft. In the diagram you can see the medullary cavity, wherein the yellow bone marrow, which is usually fats in the adults. And this medullary cavity consists of red bone marrow in the infants, which is a place for blood cell formation. Next, coming on to the bone markings, that is the processes which are usually present on the surface of the bones or surface features of the bones. So bone markings are nothing but the sites of attachment for the muscles, tendons and ligaments. They also act as passages for nerves and blood vessels. So there are two categories of bone markings. First one is the projections and processes. These are growing out from the bone surface, while depressions and cavities are indentations or the surfaces which are lying in the cavities. Then next type of bone markings are projections and processes that form the joints. Examples are the condyle, that is a large rounded prominence that forms a joint. Example is the medial condyle of the femur. Next is head. Head is the rounded projection that forms a joint and is supported on the constricted portion of a bone or neck of a bone. For example, head of the femur. Next is facet. Facet, the name itself indicates, it is a flat articular surface, smooth in nature. Example is the facet of a vertebra, which is helping the vertebra to lie on each other. Next is ramus. Ramus is the arm-like bar of the bone. For example, ramus of the mandible. Next is the processes to which the tendons, ligaments and other connective tissues are attaching to the bones. These are tuberosity. Tuberosity is large rounded projection which is usually having a rough surface. For example, deltoid tuberosity of humerus. Next is spine or spinous process, which is nothing but the sharp, slender and often pointed projection. Example is the spine of scapula. Next is trochanter. Trochanter is the large blunt projection which is found only on the femur. Example is the greater trochanter of the femur. Next is the crest. It is nothing but a narrower border of the ridge. For example, iliac crest of the pelvic girdle. Next is a line. Line is a narrow ridge of the bone which is less prominent than a crest. Example is intertrochanteric line of the femur. Next is tubercle. Tubercle is nothing but a small rounded projection or process. Example is adductor tubercle of the femur. Next comes the epicondyle, which is nothing but a raised area on or above a condyle. Example is the lateral and medial epicondyle of the femur. Next is a process which is prominence of the any bone, which is for example spinous processes of the vertebra. Next type of markings are depressions and openings. First is foramen. Foramens means a hole in a bone, which is nothing but the rounded or oval opening through a bone. For example, foramen magnum of the occipital bone of the skull. Next is a meatus. Meatus is a tube-like structure on a channel which is extending within a bone. Example is external acoustic meatus or auditory meatus, which is present in the temporal bone, which forms a part of ear. Next is the fossa. Fossa is nothing but a depression, a shallow depression which is present within the bone or on the bone, which is often serving as an articular surface. For example, mandibular fossa of the temporal bone, wherein the mandible is articulating. Next is sinus. Sinus is nothing but it's a cavity present within the bone which is filled with the air and also lines the mucous membrane. Example is the sinus of the frontal bone. Next is groove. Groove is nothing but a furrow which also acts as a slit-like structure. Example is mandibular groove. Next is fissure. Fissure is a narrow slit-like opening. For example, inferior orbital fissure. Now coming on to the microscopic anatomy after the gross anatomy of the bone. If we see the microscopic anatomy or the structure of the bone, it consists of the different component. First component is the osteon. Osteon is also known as Haversian system, which is known as one unit of bone. It consists of central Haversian canal, which is nothing but a opening in the center of the osteon or a Haversian system, which is one unit of bone. It carries blood vessels and nerves. Also, it consists of Walkman's canal or perforating canal, which is making the canals perpendicular to the central canal or Haversian canal. These are also responsible for carrying blood vessels and nerves. So here in the structure you can observe the osteon or Haversian canal, which is part of the compact bone. It forms a complete Haversian system. So one Haversian system is arranged concentrically to the Haversian canal, which is forming the central tube or canal which consists of the blood vessels. If you see the enlarged structure of the Haversian system, it consists of the lamellae. Lamellae are nothing but the concentric arrangement of the osteocytes, which can be seen as a circular line around the central canal. These lamellae consist of lacunae. Lacunae are the spaces in which the osteocytes are embedded. So, lamellae along with the lacunae and osteocytes form the concentric circles in the Haversian system. Then it also consists of the perpendicular or horizontal canals, which are also known as the canaliculus, wherein the blood vessels are arranged or supplied. So here the lamellae or the Haversian canal are associated or supplied with the blood vessels through central Haversian canal as well as perforating Walkman's canal. Also, there are some canaliculi which are connecting one cell to another through the blood vessels. So, this is the whole structure of the Haversian system of the bone. Now, looking into the details of the structure. So, lacunae are nothing but the cavities which consist the bone cells called as osteocytes. So, in the diagram you can observe the osteocytes which are present in the cavities called as lacunae, which are arranged in the concentric rings called as lamellae. Lamellae are the ring around the central canal which are sites for lacunae. Canaliculi are tiny canals which are radiating from the central canal to the lacunae and forms a transport system. So after the structure or internal structure of the bones, let us see how the changes in the human skeletal takes place from the embryonic stage to the adult stage. So in the embryonic stage, the skeleton is primarily consisting of hyaline cartilage. During the development, much of the cartilage is replaced by bone. The phenomenon is known as ossification, where os means bones. So during ossification, several minerals come into the picture and get involved in the process of ossification. So these minerals include calcium, vitamin D, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, sodium and chlorine. Then cartilage remains in the isolated areas, for example bridge of the nose, parts of the ribs and joints, wherein the ossification of this cartilage does not take place. Spongy bone formation. Spongy bone formation takes place in the beginning at the 8 weeks of the fetal development. Hyaline cartilage is present in the spongy bones. Chondrocytes, they are secreting matrix like junk, and minerals are absorbed through the matrix. Matrix hardens, which is also known as endochondral ossification. Then in the periosteum and endosteum, osteoblasts are born. Osteoblasts travel to the epiphysis through the blood vessels where they develop their structure. They secrete a matrix and absorb the minerals, and also hardening takes place, which is called as ossification. The process disappears from the osteoblast and forms a canal called as small channels or canaliculi. Trabeculae are where cartilages die and not replaced by the bone cells which are present in the spongy bones. Spaces where the cartilage cell die but not replaced. Compact bone formation. It is not replacement of the cartilage by the bone, it is direct formation of the bone. Osteoblasts from the periosteum and endosteum stay and form the compact bone. So bone growth takes place from the embryonic stage to the adult stage, and several steps are involved. Types of bone cells. Osteocytes. Osteocytes are mature bone cells. Osteoblasts are bone forming cells. Osteoclasts are bone destroying cells. And breakdown of bone matrix takes place for the remodeling and release of the calcium. Bone remodeling is a process by which both osteoblasts and osteoclasts are formed. Bone fracture is a breaking of bone, and different types of fractures are present like closed fracture and open fracture. In this diagram you can see so the fractured bones gets remodeled in the several steps like hematoma formation, fibrocartilage callus formation, bony callus formation, and bone remodeling. So students, the idea of taking this lecture was to make you understand regarding the basics of bone structure, how the development of bone takes place, what are the processes associated with the bone, and how the fracture is getting healed. Thank you so much.